And are we already recording? Oh, wonderful.
Yep, we just began.
Ian, beyond being very, very talented and capable at his job, Ian is also a mind reader, so that's helpful. Okay, so we'll just do a quick welcome and attendance as an update to the community. Selena is now totally certified to participate as a voting member, so we welcomed her to the board at our last meeting, but welcome as a voting member. Thank you. Very critical in these instances so that we have a quorum. Thank you. I'll just go ahead and call roll. Commissioner Montgomery is not here yet, right? Commissioner McCullough?
Present.
Commissioner Shotkin?
Present.
Commissioner Smith?
Here.
Commissioner Dean is absent. Commissioner Miller is also unable to join us tonight. Commissioner Evans here. Commissioner Ortiz?
Here.
Wonderful. Okay, so Ian, I think the first thing on our agenda was a chair's update and then the investigation review. Is that right?
Sorry, I was on mute. That's correct.
Okay, wonderful. So I wanted to give a kind of mid-year update. We've run into a couple of issues that for members of the public that are able to join us, just to kind of give some context. This week, we will be reviewing the last case in our current backlog. We do have a couple of pending cases that are almost ready, but we have been, we doubled our meetings for a while and have been, really trying to get through these as quickly as possible without compromising the process and some of the sensitivities. So one case was scheduled for our review today, but we pushed it to next month because the underlying charges and records were expunged. And so we need to be very kind of aware of what we can and can't discuss related to those records when we do our investigation review and get input from the complainant and their representation. There are two other cases, I think, that are also, technically ready, but they have not yet been released to the COB until the officer grievance period is complete. And then other cases that are in the queue but have not yet been released to the COB for review with the OPR report and evidence. So the significance of the backlog is that we have been instructed by the county board not to pursue community engagement, even though we've had repeated requests from members of the community, both at our meetings and receptions and independently, to bring members of the public into our conversation and engage the community in understanding what are the underlying issues that deal in public trust for law enforcement. So as we get to the end of our backlog, we're looking forward to prioritizing a conversation about community engagement and making spaces for different kinds of conversation. So for anyone listening in on the call now, if you have suggestions or venues or groups that you think would like to be engaged, we would appreciate that outreach. So the second item for discussion tonight is to do with records access. We want to talk about this because this is the second time it's come up, and we want to provide some transparency to the community. Just to let you all know that we do have some, the ordinance authorizes our access to evidence and records relating to the cases that we review, the investigations. But there are certain circumstances that require us to navigate that sensitively. So as I mentioned before, we have one case where the underlying kind of charges and access to record, the case has been exonerated, and so the underlying records need to be expunged. I don't know that I'm using the proper word in the first part, but the records have been expunged, which means ACPD no longer has access to them. They've been, moved to a part of the system where they don't have access, so we can't access them either. But we did have access to them before, so we're figuring out how to handle that. For tonight's case, we're dealing with an investigation that involves multiple children, people under the age of 18, and we had several meetings with the county attorney and other stakeholders to figure out how to handle sensitive, information pertaining to juveniles. The county attorney informed the COB that the omission of juvenile records from our access in the authorizing ordinance was intentional. And this is, something that we're looking at. What are the implications of that for our ability to review cases? So, for example, tonight we're going to review a case that involves multiple children, And we did not, accordingly, we were not given access to the body-worn camera footage, either in its kind of complete version or in a redacted form. So typically, redacting records involves blurring faces and muting audio, but the ACPD interpretation of the county attorney's guidance was that that entire file is considered a juvenile record, and that omitting their participation in the videos would prevent us from having full context for the situation that unfolds. So we also were not able to get access of excerpted clips where the complainant in this situation is an adult. So we did not actually get to view any of the body-worn camera footage between the complainant and ACPD. So we are kind of continuing conversations about what those implications mean for our purpose and mission, which is to increase and improve trust with the
Would you like to try
between the
this,
community and law enforcement. Very sweet. Our whole existence is to increase and maintain trust between law enforcement and the community. And so where we have complaints that involve juveniles, it seems very difficult that we can't review those complaints because of sensitivities, protecting juvenile records. But in these proceedings, we have anonymized all of the participants, both officers and members of the community. And so we will kind of keep having conversations with the county board and the county attorney about some of the other relevant limitations to the underlying authorizing ordinance that keep us from being able to really fulfill that mission. So on that note, tonight we were ACPD, because they are not able to share juvenile records, they will not be commenting on any of our questions or comments related to the juvenile participants in the case. So they will answer questions and provide responses relating to the complainant, but they won't be able to provide comments on the interaction between the officers and the children in this case. So I think that's all we have for the chair's update. There are a couple of recurring policy concerns that we have, particularly relating to bias-free policing and use of force. So these are issues that have come up in different cases with different contexts, but where we recognize that ACPD's review is based on current policy. And part of our job in this investigation is to review, part of our purview in these meetings is to review the investigation itself, which means going through all of the facts of the case and looking at whether or not we think OPR's conclusions about officer behavior conform to current policy. And we vote specifically based on whether or not an officer's behavior conforms to current policy. The second part of it is for us to review and identify opportunities or needs, outstanding needs, where there may need to be policy changes or new policies introduced. So as it pertains to bias-free policing, we've run into a couple of cases where bias-free policing was not included in the investigation, but it felt pertinent to the COB that there were elements of racial bias or other implicit bias in the cases. And we've had a conversation with ACPD where we've talked about that a violation of bias-free policing is a zero tolerance offense. So that means that it's a fireable offense. And we have had ongoing conversations about whether or not that means we need a separate policy for implicit bias. And recognizing that sensitivity, distinguishing between kind of malicious intent or implicit bias, we have seen recurring issues of implicit bias that we're not able to properly investigate or hold officers accountable because ACPD's interpretation of the bias-free policing policy is that it is a, fireable offense, a very serious issue and a fireable offense. So I'll lead with that. And there was one other thing. The other thing relevant to tonight's case is the interviews that were conducted by ACPD during this case were before ACPD implemented changes to their protocol related to the COB's purview. And so as we reviewed the investigators, and I think that others listened to the interviews, but Charles is my co-lead for tonight. And one of the things that sticks out to us is that these are much shorter interviews than the interviews that are being conducted now. There's no video footage, so we can't see who's in the room, and we can't see kind of observe the proceedings. But the other aspect is that similar to our kind of recurring issue about the way that bias-free policing is investigated, there are leading questions, or there are protocols in the investigation that that make it difficult to actually understand what the officer's perspective was versus what has been suggested by the interviewer with both questions and suggested answers. So we'll get into that a little bit tonight, but I did want to note that ACPD has made changes to their interview protocol since this case. So yeah, we will go ahead and kick it over to the investigation review. Mummy, did you have updates for tonight's meeting that you wanted to go over at the beginning?
No, I'll save mine for the end.
Okay. Okay, so as we move into the investigation review, we just want to reiterate that for this investigation, the COB did not have access to body-worn camera footage. So what we did review were audio files of the officer interviews and the OPR, Office of Professional Responsibilities report. The Office of Professional Responsibilities report had some redactions, but did include some transcriptions of the dialogue, excerpts of the dialogue between officers and the complainant. And so we'll do the best that we can to kind of reference where the information is coming from in the summary. But other than that, I'll turn it over to you, Charles. Do you want to go over the kind of high level overview?
Yes, I'll do that. But before I do that, as co-lead of this case and an attorney who's practiced in the area of administrative law for goodness, over 20 years now, I would be remiss if I didn't speak more to the juvenile records issue. And again, this is the county attorney's office, ACPD participants, and along with the board acquiescing, county board acquiescing is asserting a broad interpretation of the statute. And a casual interpretation of the statute can be read that the COB IPA can't see juvenile records, right? But the issue isn't necessarily that. It is, are these juvenile records? And that's really where the crux of the actual debate is. And what really needs to be done is you might want to, if the question is, and if the debate then really is on the nature of juvenile records, you might want to ask a court or the attorney general for their take, and because it's not a clear thing. So if you want to know what juvenile records means in the law, there are actually a few choices. You can ask the attorney general for their opinion, which the courts in Virginia, it's not dispositive, but it can provide some indication. There's also an option baked into the statute to ask a court directly to make a call on it. And then there's also a regular court order, special ruling called declaratory judgment that could clear things up. So there were avenues to actually answer the core question is, were these in fact juvenile records? So to that end, I am troubled that this broad interpretation by the county attorney, co-signed by the county board, where it leaves us. In this situation, it is an adult complainant with children, but we can imagine where children can be in situations where we would need to have a role of interpreting things. What if this was domestic dispute where children could be around? What if this was an incident at schools where children are around? Unfortunately, a lot of things that what we see in the society, also, we often see minority children coming into situations with the police, which may not be the most positive. And to think that because of this broad interpretation of what a juvenile record is, without using the resources that are already there to just interpret whether these are juvenile records, it leaves us wanting, and the community wanting, to have a review of situations where children just merely may be present, not the subject of, but merely may be present. So I am hopeful that in time we can avail ourselves, the county attorney, the county board will avail themselves of those means by which we can actually answer the crux of the argument is, what is the nature of a juvenile record, and is this such? So thank you, Chair Evans, for giving me that that little bit of bully pulpit. But let me get down from my soapbox now and get us on to the case at hand. And this one, it has many components. There's many components to it. So we're going to break it down into three components: the initial stop and detention, the fraudulent tag investigation, and the officer interaction with the complainant and children. So starting with the initial stop and detention, Officer 1 initiated a traffic stop for stolen license plates on the complainant's vehicle after noticing that the tags appeared faded with an unconventional number sequence for the current distribution of paper tags at that time, temporary tags at that time. And when those temporary tags were ran, it returned the result of a stolen black Toyota registered in Virginia Beach. This vehicle was a red minivan type vehicle. 5 officers responded to the scene in response to Officer 1's radio for assistance, and Officer 1 stated that as officers arrived on the scene, he and Officer 5 discussed the situation and, I quote, decided that they would just walk up to the vehicle since they had sufficient officers. So 4 officers approached the vehicle, and Officer 1 reports that he asked the complainant to step outside the vehicle, which she did, and that he had her sit on the curb. The timeline's a little bit opaque since Officer 3 stated that he immediately put her in handcuffs. So again, we don't have access to that footage, so we don't know if she complied with the instructions to sit on the curb before being handcuffed or not. Officer 3 said that the children were also removed from the vehicle and placed in handcuffs, except for the youngest one, who was left in the car under the supervision of Officer 4. When asked about the use of handcuffs in their interview, Officer 1 stated that he really didn't believe that they had anything to do with the investigation, and stated that the reason for using handcuffs was because of the sheer number of occupants. So it wasn't that the children had anything to do with the investigation, but just the sheer number of occupants of the vehicle that were there, the number of children. Officer 2 noted in his interview that the reason for the use of handcuffs was because stolen vehicles might involve guns, might be somebody wanted, might be drugs. You just never know. Officers did not report searching the vehicle upon removing the occupants from the car, but only later, before the car was towed, to conduct the protocol specified inventory search. That's the time at which they inspected the car. No specific threat of harm or risk factor was identified by any officers during the initial interaction or subsequent detention period. So that pretty much sums up in the first part, the initial stop and detention. The next facet that we'll look at is the fraudulent tag investigation. So Officer 1, like I was saying before, went to investigate the tag and reported that the front and back temporary tags, they looked like they were photocopied to replace one of the numbers on the tags because it returned a registration to a different vehicle type. Like I was saying earlier, a black Toyota as opposed to the car in issue, which was a red minivan type car. Officer 1 also noted in his interview that when he searched the database for the stolen vehicle of a different type, it returned a vehicle of a different type, and that he reported that one of the tags was stolen. So the database again says that one of these temporary tags is stolen. So that confirmed his belief that the tags had been photocopied, because there were 2 tags on the complainant's car, but the report back from his investigation is that one tag was stolen. When Officer 1 asked the complainant where she got the tags, she reported that she, in her words, had them since she bought the car 2 years ago, to which Officer 1 replied that that was impossible because the sequence of the numbers on that particular tag, again, this led him to believe that the tags had been stolen in the current year, but again, not referencing a date in the database record. And then the final part of this is the officer interaction with the complainant and with the children. Okay, so now, stepping back a bit in this timeline, Officer 3 reports that he tried to explain the reason for the stop multiple times and reported that the complainant was not happy with Officer 1 because he initiated the stop, and not happy with Officer 3 at all because Officer 3 was the one who placed her in handcuffs. Officer 3 stated that multiple officers rotated through trying to talk with her because she wouldn't, in their opinion, the complainant wouldn't listen. Officer 1 noted that the complainant was pretty upset through the whole thing. Those were his exact words, and that nothing he tried in conversation could, in his words, get her to calm down. Officer 2 stated that she would go off, his words, when she tried to answer her questions, and Officer 2 also described the complainant as impossible to talk to. The OPR report notes that the complainant admitted her tags were bad and she had no registration, but this was not identified by any other officers in their interviews. So again, absent the body-worn camera footage, the COB cannot confirm this assertion that was in the OPR report. The OPR report notes that the complainant talked over officers and did not listen for answers, and contains several transcriptions of conversational excerpts. OPR's report pointed to multiple comments by Officer 3 to the complainant and her children, including when Officer 3 told the complainant that she can cry later after I'm finished interro, as in the first syllables of interrogation, interro, after I'm finished talking to you, he said, to complete his sentence, cutting off the word interrogation. And while interacting with the children, Officer 3 remarked, if your mother and your brother would shut up and actually listen to me, you know, this situation would probably resolve itself quicker. Again, his exact quote, if your mother and brother would shut up and actually listen to me. The report also notes that Officer 2 used profanity in his exchange with the complainant after she said, I don't give an F, it's the system. You know, Officer 2 replied, listen to what I'm saying, though. Listen, this is an effing jailable offense. I don't want to do that. I want to leave you in your car. I want to get this over with. It's hot. I want to go home. So they didn't say effing. They said the whole word. But right now, I don't know to what extent when this recording is posted, we have to put up, you know, disclaimers if I use that word. But that word was used, and it should be noted that I can't use that word because when this is posted, you know, we can't necessarily use that word. The complainant spoke with the supervising officer who was called to the scene. At one point, the supervising officer was called to the scene. And at the end of the interaction, the complainant was described as, was described as presenting with aggression, at that time. And but the complainant did ask for a full report and every officer's information. The supervising officer provided the complainant with his business card, a case number, and explanation that a report would be written. Ultimately, the complainant and her children were released from handcuffs and allowed to gather their belongings from the vehicle before it was towed. Officer 1 issued the complainant a citation for violation of Virginia Code 46-2-613 for an improperly registered vehicle. He canceled the tag confirmation through dispatch to the Virginia Beach PD. Again, that's where this stolen tag was ringing up. And again, the investigation revealed that the tags were not actually reported stolen tags, I guess, in that sense. Again, one tag. The OPR report also notes that after the investigation concluded that Officer 2 referred to the complainant as an effing B. Again, he used the whole words, but I have to be mindful of when this is posted later. In conversation with Officer 1. The interview recording with Officer 3 also reveals that he quipped that this time about his time in this entire situation, saying that, hey, maybe we should give these children stickers, for all that they've been through. This little quip that he made, and he later said, and I quote, I thought that was funny, that the quip that he made about we should give these children stickers. As a result of the complaint, OPR conducted an investigation of the incident and potential policy violations for several of the involved officers, including personal contacts, duty responsibilities. The investigation did not include a review of bias-free policing or the use of force. So that is a summary of it. That's what we were able to divine from looking at the written record as far as the interviews. But for my part, I want to say that this, again, would have been much easier to see, and we've been able to delve even deeper into our analysis had we had access to that body-worn camera footage. And I would be remiss to add that even the words of Officer 3 in his interview suggest that, and I quote, at minute 12 of his interview, "If you're able to review the body camera footage, it is very clear." And so the officer knows that, and I wish that, again, that broad interpretation wasn't there, and we availed ourselves, and we were able to avail ourselves of that body-worn camera footage.
Thank you, Charles. I want to add, this was an omission on my part, but there are actually 3 policy violations included in OPR's: review personal contacts, preliminary and follow-up investigations, and duty responsibilities, which, Mommy, thank you for putting in the chat. That was my fault in the summary. So yeah, I mean, in looking at what we can look at this, our approach is similar to always, which is that we want to understand what is the officer's perspective and what do they know going into the scene, what is the community member's perspective as they're coming into the situation, and then once we look at the facts of the case and vote, we can talk about larger policy recommendations or elements where the current policy may not be sufficient. So we had multiple officers respond to this scene because of the kinds of risks that can be associated with a stolen vehicle. And the decision for them to remain on site seems to be because of the number of vehicle occupants to secure the scene, because there are 6 total occupants of the vehicle, a mom traveling with her 5 children, 4 of whom were taken out of the vehicle. So the scene itself is 5 people sitting on the side of the curb, the youngest child kept in the vehicle under the supervision of an officer. So there were 5, there were 7 officers on scene plus a supervising officer. And the subject officers for the investigation are officers 1, 2, and 3. Officer 1 initiated the traffic stop. He was on patrol when he saw the faded tags, and he primarily led the investigation into the tags, and then did interview the complainant. Officer 2 was one of multiple officers that engaged with the complainant during the stop, including the interview, and Officer 3 was noted to have handcuffed the complainant and stayed with her while Officer 1 investigated the tags. We didn't have clarification on which officer placed the children in handcuffs. So that was a piece of information that we didn't have because of the inability to review body-worn camera footage. So, we have multiple officers respond to this scene. They confer on initial arrival to decide whether or not they can approach the vehicle, and they decide to approach the vehicle. No weapons drawn, just a normal kind of traffic stop approach. Another officer that responds later, responds with his gun drawn, but holsters it once he sees that the other officers were treating this not as a high-risk stop, and holsters his weapon before he approaches the scene. The complainant and her 5 children are on their way to, what turns out to be a trip to the zoo. And they were very confused and frustrated by the disruption of their plans. It took a while for them to understand why they were being stopped and why they were being taken out of the vehicle, even though they were immediately placed in handcuffs. So the complainant was placed in handcuffs initially. 4 of her 5 children are taken out of the car and also immediately placed in handcuffs. The officer's description of that in the interview is that was to secure the scene because of the large number of people. They all 5 occupants of the vehicle sat on the curb for 48 minutes in handcuffs while the officers investigated the situation. From the transcripts that we read, there was definitely, it seemed, talking over each other, going back and forth. It seems like the officers cited, a difficulty being able to explain the situation to the complainant, who is frustrated that her day has been interrupted and she doesn't understand why she's being stopped. So there are 5 kind of pieces of this that stuck out to Charles and I in the investigation review. The first, and I'll just summarize them and then I'll go into a few specifics, and then I'll let the COB ask comments before we turn it to Mummy and Captain Kim to add additional comments. So 1, initially this was not treated as a high-risk stop. The vehicle type did not match the stolen vehicle that came back. So this starts to become a matter of fake tags, not a stolen vehicle. There was no specifically reported threat of harm or indication of a specific risk. The officers did not conduct an inventory search of the vehicle until before it was towed, which is part of a protocol before a vehicle is towed. So there was not there did not seem to be a concern by the officers that there might be something dangerous in this vehicle. Officer interviews revealed that they are aware that fake tags are sold on the market, and said that denying knowledge of the improper tags is a typical response from people who may not be aware that they, purchased a vehicle with stolen tags. I think it was Officer 3 who in his interview acknowledged that generally fake tags are a no harm, no foul kind of situation, not the same kind of concern as a stolen vehicle. And also that Officer 3 reported that he approached with his gun drawn, but holstered it when he saw that other officers had approached the vehicle without additional kind of security. The second 2 issues that we had are handcuffs on the complainant and handcuffs on the children, which are related but separate. So handcuffs going on the complainant, it does not, there's not an indication in this that she was given an instruction to sit on the curb or stand somewhere that she was not complying with, that she needed to go in handcuffs. The driver's out of the vehicle. This is at the time, the suspicion is that this is a stolen vehicle. So removing her from the vehicle may have been appropriate to, prevent somebody from trying to flee the scene. But getting out of the vehicle, she was not given a chance to physically comply with orders. And the conversation, amongst officers in the interviews is that she was agitated or talking over them or unwilling to listen. And so it does not seem clear that she was given an opportunity to comply before she was placed in handcuffs. The same situation for her 4 children who were taken out of the vehicle and immediately placed in handcuffs, where they were not given an opportunity to be told to stand somewhere specific or sit on the curb. There were multiple officers on the scene securing the scene. So you have a kind of perception of force already on the scene. And Officer 1 said in his interview, "I really didn't believe that they had anything to do with the investigation." So we have a real problem there with, this is a Black family trying to go to the zoo and being pulled over for a stolen vehicle. There's this underlying suspicion that there is something else going on here or some other risk that does not seem like this is how it would have been handled for a white family. It's uncomfortable, but it's just very difficult for me to imagine that scenario happening to my family. So the handcuffs on the children is a big piece of our issue about this case being handled as a very likely instance of at least implicit bias and also an excessive use of force with children. The fourth aspect of our investigation review was that there were multiple disrespectful, profane, and or mocking comments. So Officer 3 saying, you can cry later when I'm finished talking to you did not seem very courteous. But my real issue was with Officer 3 saying, if your mother and your brother would shut up, and that in his subsequent interview, he said he absolutely meant it. That there was not kind of an apologetic, like it was frustrating, I was frustrated, I shouldn't have said it. It was still kind of angry with the dynamic as it was unfolding, which, as we've contextualized with children, it's very difficult to imagine that any mother or any person being pulled out of their car with their children in handcuffs is not going to be agitated when they don't understand why they've been pulled over and taken out of their vehicle. Officer 3, as Charles mentioned, after the scene, after the complainant and her children had been removed from handcuffs and released from the scene. Officer 3 referred to the complainant as a fucking bitch. And we've revisited this in other kind of aspects where this was not heard by the complainant in real time, but we have had previous situations where complainants FOIA their body-worn camera footage. And so the use of profanity and the kind of derogatory, denigrating language is a problem, even if she didn't hear it. That's not the kind of regard that that's going to build trust with community members. Officer 2's comment about should we give them stickers is very inconsistent with the notion that these children were being treated as near adults, which is a quote that came up in one of the interviews. So, we have this kind of underlying issue of adultifying these children because they are not young children and not being treated as separate from the investigation, in accordance with what Officer 1 said, that he really didn't believe they had anything to do with the investigation. So then the fifth element is the investigation protocol. And again, we are aware that ACPD has changed some of the protocols, including video footage, and that the current interviews are much longer. These interviews stuck out as very short and almost perfunctory. I think that the real problem we had with the investigation, the interviews in this case, was that there was almost a constant presence of either leading questions or suggested answers. So Officer 2 the interviewer introduced language to Officer 2 when talking about the interaction between the complainant, saying that she was loud and yelling and being very difficult before Officer 2 had articulated any of those elements in the interaction. Similarly, when interviewing Officer 3, the interviewer suggested that his interaction with the complainant was a response to her being argumentative, which was not a word that the officer had used in his own description. So he's offering kind of these elements of the body-worn camera footage that he's seen, but that the purpose of the interview questions is to get the officers to recall and recount in their own words what was motivating their decision. So when the question is posed as, this was because she was being argumentative, or, this was loud and being very difficult. And then the second issue that we had with the investigation is that the interviewer was very heavily reinforcing the adultification of these children. So the interviewer asked Officer 1 how old the kids were, and Officer 1 replied that the youngest one was probably 6 and the oldest was probably 16. And the interviewer responded that one younger and the rest were older, probably in their teens. Similarly, in the interview with Officer 2, the interviewer proactively offered all of them were kids, but they were older kids, not like 9 or 10, but like 15 or 16, like full sized, right? Similarly, in the interview with Officer 3, the interviewer said, and when Officer 3 mentioned kids, clarified and said, when you say kids, these were not like 8-year-olds. And so the underlying issue with this is that it doesn't matter if they were 15 or 16 or 7 or 8. What matters is that these are children that had nothing to do with the investigation. And because this was not treated as a high-risk stop, it's very unclear why they could not have been supervised by an officer in the vehicle the way that the younger child was treated. So there's a clear disparity between the way the children are treated amongst themselves, and knowing that this is a kind of documented systemic issue with law enforcement and the criminal justice system. It's very difficult to understand how this is conformant to duty responsibilities when these kids didn't have anything to do with the investigation. So I think that's all that we had. Charles, was there anything else you wanted to add?
Right. With regard to the interviews, just stay an aside, but worth noting that I believe it's Officer 2's interview at this point, all those interviews have been just with the officer signing particular disclosures and recognitions of the confidentiality of the proceeding. But for Officer 2 in this situation, the supervising officer was present during that interview and was not made to sign any sort of paperwork as any other interviewer was. And at the last part of Officer 2's interview was asked questions that appeared in OPR's report. So you can imagine, again, the potential of neutrality or influence on Officer 2's answers if a supervising officer is there. And then with regard to then asking the supervising officer questions, if the supervising officer was thought to be in a position to be questioned, then they should have been put into the formal process and given all of their given knowledge of all of their rights and privileges, and made to sign all of the necessary disclosures. And that wasn't done in this process.
Members of the commission, do you guys or board, do you guys have other clarifying questions or issues that we want to put in front of ACPD to respond to? Lisa?
I was curious as to whether or not, and apologies if this was in the interviews and I forgot it, but whether they had to tow the vehicle, you know, whether there was sort of a requirement to tow it. I'm just wondering.
I think that did come up in the conversation during the exchange. There was some discussion about, you know, she wanted it towed with her AAA membership, for example, and it had been told to her that she might have it towed to her house earlier, but that, you know, during the course of the situation, it had to be towed by a different company, and it was towed to her house. So that's why the inventory search was conducted.
No,
but the citation issued was for an improperly registered vehicle. So I think that's
okay. And so is that, and you're required to tow a vehicle if it's improperly registered? That's what I'm wondering.
Okay.
That's
Selena.
I just had one additional comment or clarification, which was that there was some inference that mental health was involved in this. So it was the sergeant said that he thought this was mental health related. And I think this has an impact on how the children were addressed during this call. And I don't see it really being addressed anywhere in the report other than noting it. And I think it had an impact in the stop. Thanks.
Okay. I think you're referring to the supervising officer who said after speaking with her, I didn't think she was altogether mentally. There were some mental issues. I could tell I wasn't getting anywhere. So I just wanted to get her and her family away from the scene.
Yes.
Okay. Dave?
Yeah. So one thing that occurred to me that I didn't see happened, and I'm just curious if this would be part of the standard expectation for investigations, which is I wasn't aware that the officers made any attempt to identify up front what the relationship between the complaining witness woman driving the vehicle and the other people in the car. It was obvious that there was a 6-year-old. So it was obvious from the get-go that there was a young child, which in and of itself is not consistent with, you know, a stolen vehicle. And you've already outlined why, for other reasons, at the point they approached the car, that I believe that their understanding was that this was not a stolen vehicle, and they were really approaching it as a low-risk situation for stolen tags. But, and just to clarify, I think that my recollection is from what the complaining witness said, that 3 of them were her children and the other 2 were niece and nephew. But in any event, they were part of her family. And again, I don't know if the officers asked that. I think that would have been something I would have expected them to identify. And when you know that, if you know that, that does change the dynamics of the whole situation. I think it goes to whether there was a need for the children, the juveniles, to be cuffed. And the other piece is, because this was an investigation for stolen tags, unlike an investigation for contraband, where you could say there could be joint constructive possession. So maybe all of them have some involvement in some contraband in the car. A joint tag or a stolen tag by definition can't be an offense committed by the other people in the car, by more than one person. It can only be committed essentially by the registrant of the car. So again, you know, I think the perception, and my perception, was that it was disappointing that they did this in that way. And so my question would be, wouldn't that be an expected investigatory tactic to understand, both for officer safety and for how the matter unfolds for the community. What is the relationship between this woman driving the car and these children in the car? Finally, and this is not a question, but I mean, I did note in the interview several points that the officer said we needed to raise our voice to match the level of the voice of the complaining witness. I can't imagine that ACPD would agree that that is, in this situation, the appropriate approach. As you know, when the complaining witness gets pulled out of the car without being told what is going on and immediately cuffed, and then they say, well, here, now we're going to tell you why you're being cuffed. That seems backwards to me. I would think you would want to explain what is the relationship. We've got a concern about the stolen tag. Can you please get out of the car? Is a lot different than get out of the car. I'm going to handcuff you. And then I'm going to explain, but now you're too loud. I can't hear you. I mean, at that point, they've already lost, I think. And the final thing was at several points, one of the officers said that he was trying to tell the complaining witness, this isn't a big deal. It is a big deal. I mean, it is a big deal how people are treated. And I'm sure that ACPD agrees with that. But again, that goes to the interview, which was nothing. It's like, okay, I understand. It is a big deal. I mean, how every person in the community is treated is a big deal. So that's all for now.
Dave, I wanted to add one thing, which was that two things. One, you know, I think a big piece of this in our investigation review conversation was, of course, she's upset from the get-go, because to your point, she's taken out of her vehicle and placed in handcuffs before she's explained the situation. And then her children the children that she's traveling with, including her own children, get out of the car and are placed in handcuffs. And if I am a Black mother with, traveling with Black children, some of whom are mine, right? I am paranoid. I'm frustrated. I'm very probably scared. And, so the tone, the idea that we would match the tone demonstrates kind of a lack of ability to empathize with the mindset of the woman who's the complainant, right? The adult who's part of this investigation and who's been pulled over as the driver of this vehicle. And so that stuck out to me. The other thing was that nope, I lost it. Lisa.
Well, I was gonna say, if I may.
I'm sorry, I did have one
more.
Sorry.
Yeah, Lisa, I'm sorry, Lisa.
No, not at all. But just before I forget, so this idea of them having to handcuff them because there were so many people, there were 7 officers and there were 6 individuals, and 5 of them were juveniles. One of them was 6 years old, possibly. So I'm just wondering what the training or protocol is on that issue of controlling groups. Like, it would seem to me if you outnumber them and 5 of them are children, you don't necessarily have to have the same level of concern. And as you, Julie, or Charles, you may have said, the first thing that I thought of is, why didn't they just leave them in the car?
Or put them back in the car.
Or put them back in the car once they, felt, I don't know what, that they weren't armed, or I don't even know what. But once they felt reasonably confident that, that they weren't an obvious threat, yeah, put them back in the car. Because it goes without saying that the traumatic experience those kids went through is never going to leave them. And God, I pray to God that that's the only time that's ever happened to them. But I can't even imagine what it would have felt to me as a teenager being handcuffed when my mother is on the sidewalk also handcuffed. So I'm just, the level of trauma that I've been trying to keep this back, but the level of trauma that these people went through, there is no fixing that. And there were so many other choices that could have been made. I was just like in tears through the whole thing, because I was thinking of myself and my child, and it's like, what would that be like? So I don't want to keep lecturing, but it's just, so I really am trying to understand from ACPD's perspective, how do you handle it when it's a larger group where there are other things they could have done, is basically, I guess, what I'm getting to. Anyway.
So we did look into a little bit. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Charles, you were next.
I think we're going to say the same thing, and you'll see that in our suggestions about when we're dealing with groups, particularly with children, and children when this is a situation that's already been assessed as nonviolent in nature. This has already been assessed as something that doesn't present an obvious danger. So then, how then in this situation can we call out and describe a policy or practices in situations that are like this with children? They're non-dangerous, non-felonious situations with children. Lisa, it speaks, what you're saying, it speaks to, again, adultification, which Julie brought up, that these children, you know, the mothers on the side of the street, fraudulent tags, but it was these children who were robbed. They were robbed of this carefree, this nurturing environment that childhood is supposed to be. That was taken away from them by these officers. And this adultification is a bias, and it's a serious issue with children of color. It is being perceived and treated as older than they are. And it leads to them being held to higher standards of behavior, facing harsher discipline, which we saw in these handcuffs. It happens in handcuffs. It also happens in the school environment, and in this situation, like you just said, Julie, prematurely encountering the criminal justice system. And that is what happened. And this is rooted in long-standing stereotypes, and they have these long-lasting negative effects. And the nature of the investigation and how it was done did not look at implicit bias in that way, and that has to change. Dave, you in eloquently speaking to, again, this idea of this woman being angry, being constantly described as angry. Julie, you pointed it out in different interviews and in the text. You could see it being repeated by OPR investigators and the police more than half a dozen times in certain instances. This idea of this angry person, I'll call this type of bias what it is. It's dehumanization. That's what it is. Now, typically, when you say dehumanization, people say, "Oh, Charles, when you say dehumanization, no one took her personhood away." That's one side of the spectrum of dehumanization. The other side of the spectrum of dehumanization is when we take away human qualities. And the most basic of human qualities is emotion. Defending our children. So when you particularly stereotype African-American women as being angry or overly aggressive, dehumanizing it in that way, it's done unfairly because it's diminishing their individual experiences and their feelings as mothers in this society who have to protect their children from these threats. It strips away, just when you say, "Oh, well, this person's just angry, this person just you couldn't deal with them," it strips away the complexity of human emotions. That is dehumanization. That is a level of bias, an implicit bias, when you reduce it to a simplistic negative characteristic of that angry Black woman, or as they said, an effing B. That's the bias that leads to the lack of empathy that gave us the, "Oh, here goes some stickers," or, "Oh, you can cry about that later." And that perpetuates harmful stereotypes. David, you said it right. Lisa, you said it right. And I am hopeful that as we continue, again, I say it every time, being co-creators in this, that we change and we adjust how we are looking and interpreting the biases that we are investigating. Because unfortunately, in this situation, it has become more apparent to me that we also see these biases creeping in the style of the OPR review. And that's a problem, because then it leads to officers reinforcing officers who otherwise may have learned that, well, this is bias. But when the people policing may inhabit those same biases, then what happens?
So I want to link this to our conversation about the review of the officer behavior specifically, because this did come up in the interviews. One of the officers made a comment about, there's no CIT training that could teach you, that could equip you to deal with a person like this, right? And that's where, our issue with the personal contacts and the duty responsibilities here is that there is not a recognition that the disposition of this person is a reaction to the way that ACPD was handling the situation, and that it did not seem to warrant the kind of use of force, and that then the distinction in, treating the younger child differently than the older children, does speak to a possibly implicit but racial bias about, what these older teens or near adults are capable of. And so we will have a kind of a more conversation after we vote, hear from Mummy, Captain Kim, and vote. But what we found in our review of other kind of national best practice for having separate policies for dealing with children, the kind of most commonly cited opposition to that is that children of different ages are capable of different things. And so when we look at this, right, like making an age distinction policy is how the courts deal with this, right? Like we can't access these records because they're juvenile records, because we have to protect minors. But then we don't have policies to protect minors in the daily interactions with law enforcement. And that in this situation, we're seeing a distinction between someone who might be 6 and someone who might be 16 or full-sized or near adult, when what we should be looking for is indications of specific behavior. So if somebody calls the police to report suspicious behavior of a group of teens somewhere where there's some cause for, security concern, or here's something, that's a very different response to a group of children than a group of children who are in a van going to the zoo with their family that have been pulled over for fake tags where there was no specific indication of a threat of violence or a specific risk, and that in taking them out of the vehicle and patting them down, there was no indication that they, there was a note in the OPR report about occupants of the vehicle being uncooperative. And my issue with that is I don't think that they were given a chance to cooperate because the scene was secured the way that it was, as quickly as it was, instead of issuing kind of de-escalating commands to say, sit down, let's talk about this. And so I think that the prompt for her, for the complainant's reaction, really was a response to an escalating behavior by ACPD in their initial handling. Selena?
We've talked quite a lot about the adultification issue, which I think is really significant. It's been commented on very eloquently by Charles and by Lisa. I also wanted to go back to the effing B comment. I know that happened out of earshot of the complainant. I still don't think there's any level at which this is acceptable. The officer was in uniform. He said the comment. I have to say that as an Arlington resident, that makes me feel less safe. That's how this officer thinks about women. And that is sort of his snap judgment that she's an F&B. And while I don't think it rises to the level of some of these racial issues, I don't want us to miss that either, because clearly there is some education that needs to take place there, that if you're in uniform, you can't speak that way. I guess we can't police what people think, but we certainly can monitor how they behave in uniform and what they say. And that I'm very disturbed that comment was made. Thank you.
I mean, similar to telling the child who was interacting with one of the officers that if your brother and mother would shut up. I've never heard somebody courteously told to shut up. And, I recognize the tension that was at play, but these are professional.
It doesn't de-escalate the situation.
Public service. Yeah. Okay, so we have personal contacts, duty responsibilities, and preliminary and follow-up investigations. We'll hear from Mummy and then Captain Kim before we make recommendations and vote. So we have a little bit more context. Mummy?
Thanks, Julie. Appreciate the discussion. You all covered the facts and a lot of the issues in the case very thoroughly. So I will not go into a lot of detail there and just kind of go into the specifics around the allegations and then some of the recommendations that I made. But I first also want to, preface the discussion with there are sensitivities around these complaints on both sides, right? And that's kind of our role, is to kind of highlight and weigh the sensitivities on one side, right? You have community members here who certainly felt traumatized and threatened and dehumanized by the incident that took place. And as community members, obviously, like, we want to highlight that, and we want to talk about ways in which we would like to see this done better. The whole point of what we're doing here is to be able to inform from a community perspective, police policies, practices, procedures. We also are mindful of the fact that on the other side of this are police officers who come to work every day and put their lives at risk and have to make a lot of very quick split-second judgment calls on what actions they need to take to protect themselves. And that is not to be lost in this discussion, and not to be undermined in any way. I just want to make it clear that the recommendations and the things that we're pointing out here is not to make light of that, but to inform how we should be thinking about these other outside factors of the impact on the people on the receiving end of these police actions, and think about ways in which we can fine tune some of those policies and practices and procedures to make sure that both parties are able to walk away from those situations, go home to their families, and feel safe and feel respected, and have a positive encounter, which in turn, as Julie said, like, this is something that will actually help and increase officer safety when the people who they are policing in the communities feel safe in the presence of police officers. And that was certainly not the case in this specific incident. And that's why we're taking such great lengths to talk specifically about the trauma that the complainant and her kids went through. And I think it's especially important to underscore, because it was not communicated, it didn't come across from the officers' sentiments about the incident, both during and post incident, nor did it come across from the investigation, internally, from what I was able to review. I also just want to preface that this specific investigation took place before we started doing collaborative investigations. So this investigation, I believe this complaint came in during the time where we were in the final stages of passing our MOU and finalizing that. And then as far as the interviews go, once I was onboarded and kind of got a little bit more insight about how the investigations go, I realized that there was not a video recorded interview or an opportunity for me to be physically present during the interview. So I advocated to have cameras installed so that I could monitor the interviews live and be able to participate vis-a-vis the captain of OPR, the commander of OPR, Captain Kim. And so we sit in and monitor those videos, those interviews live. Now, when these interviews happened, they were still being just voice recorded, and I was not present during these interviews. And so I reviewed them after the fact. And I echo the comments that some of you all made about the quality of those interviews. I think that I can say for sure that the interviews that I've been a part of since I've started collaborating in the investigations, I've certainly given feedback along the way for sure, but they are infinitely better than the interviews that I heard in this case. And so I want to highlight that as well, because I think that is a way in which OPR has enhanced its investigations. And I would like to say that, we had a role in that. That oversight is, these are some of our silent wins, right? Like, that we are increasing the thoroughness and the quality of the investigations. And it's not always about a sustained or not sustained allegation or how we might feel about a particular finding or an action, but more about how we're increasing the quality, the thoroughness of the investigations, training, and policies, and making a larger impact on the culture. And that's where I feel like we should certainly be highlighting and really focusing our attention on our impacts. That being said, I also wanted to make two quick factual clarifications. I think you touched on one, Selena, which was that the comment about the complainant being called an FMB was made outside of the earshot of the complainant. I'll get to that when I talk about personal context. It doesn't change the nature of my particular analysis or finding, but just to make sure that that's highlighted in the discussion. And then secondly, I just, from my understanding, the vehicle was initially when the tags were first ran and it came back in the system, it came back as a stolen vehicle. And so when they approached the vehicle because it didn't match the description, right? So the tags come back as a stolen vehicle, but it's like a black sedan, and the complainant is driving a minivan of a different color. So they're kind of already putting two together that it probably is not a match. However, they're still conducting the traffic stop to complete that investigation and just cross-check and make sure that that is not the case. But I think the primary focus of the investigation, based on the facts they had at hand, and we see that through how the officers approached the stop, which might have been different if they thought it was an actual stolen vehicle. They approached it as a more low-risk stop. But certainly, I think, there was still some investigation that was conducted throughout the stop to just make sure that it was not a stolen vehicle. And I'm also drawing that from the fact that as Officer 1 is going back and now rerunning the tags and doing kind of like a deeper dive into some enhanced police systems, he's able to call the neighboring jurisdiction where the vehicle was reported stolen and actually found out it was just the stolen tags and not the vehicle. But just for purposes of, complete objectivity, I do think that what's a little bit tricky about this one is that when the officers are approaching the vehicle, it's kind of this hodgepodge situation where they don't think it's a stolen vehicle. They actually said, we weren't sure that it was a stolen vehicle. And so there was some discretion exercise, and I think it was commendable discretion in that they didn't approach the vehicle with guns drawn and, full situation that could have gone even worse. And then there was additional discretion exercised that I wanted to highlight from Officer 5, who my understanding is it was his discretion to leave the youngest child in the vehicle. And I'm not sure that was highlighted in the fact pattern. There are 5 kids. The youngest one was left in the vehicle and guarded by that officer, and the other 4 who were a little older, but certainly not adults and should not have been referred to as almost adults. They were the ones that were taken out of the vehicle and handcuffed. And so I do also commend that exercise of discretion. I wish that there had been some guidance around how to treat the other kids who were slightly older in a similar, more humane fashion. But I think that's kind of what we are trying to parse out here. How do we handle situations like this where we have not just crowd control, as you mentioned, Lisa, but specifically, and I think you mentioned this as well, Julie, like how do we deal with a group that consists of kids, and how do we treat that differently? One of the policy recommendations that I highlighted in this was that there isn't a clear policy that handles juvenile situations differently. And I do think that there is room for that because save for a few specific enumerated felonies, if you want to call it, or acts of violence or any sort of like serious, allegations of misconduct, there might be some kind of, even in the law, there's some specifications around how kids might be treated in certain situations versus other situations. But even then it breaks down age brackets. And, officers may not always be equipped with that information to know exactly where in the age range they fall, but clearly they knew that they were, kids. And we can certainly ask them questions to figure out how old people are and then deal with them appropriately. But there isn't currently guidance around that. So I think, to that, there should be guidance, right? And to that extent, we also have to keep in mind that a lot of the actions on behalf of the officers were discretionary because there isn't clear policy around these things. The problem is when you have discretion to do or not do certain things, and there isn't clear guidance or policy, sometimes that's good to be able to exercise discretion, as in the case of Officer 5, who used his discretion in a positive way to leave the youngest child in the car. But sometimes it's bad in that it can have disparate impacts on different people of different genders, races, socioeconomic status, you name it. When there is discretion, there is an opportunity for our implicit biases or different things like that to show up in how we make decisions. And so I think to that extent, there should be some balancing there of, obviously we want officers to be able to exercise discretion based on the circumstances, but there should be some guidance that helps kind of facilitate what factors an officer should consider before making calls that can have such traumatic impacts as the ones here. All right, so now that's kind of the macro stuff that I wanted to talk about. The preliminary and follow-up investigations, the complainant specific allegation was that the officer put the wrong information into the system, and that's why this whole stop was conducted. I did not find any merit to that in my review of the investigation. It did not appear to me that any wrong information was put in there. However, I did still not sustain the allegation because I do think that asking a few questions when pulling the complainant over in the first place might have enhanced the investigation and reduced the duration of the stop, which, as Julie mentioned, lasted about 48 minutes or so. I apologize if you all hear my child in the background. But I think the duration of the stop is also part of the kind of like, fairness piece that we'll talk about in duty and responsibility. So I'll save that for then. Personal contacts. So I also found that it was interesting with personal contacts, and I wanted to read the second part of that, of the last sentence, I believe it is, of that policy. It says the personal biases or attitudes of the employee must not influence their decision to take police action other than what is justified or expected within the constraints of discretion. It's interesting because I don't think that we've ever really focused in on that portion of the policy before. I think when we've talked about personal contacts in other incidents, it's been more about, what someone said verbally. And I don't know that I don't really necessarily think that personal contacts is the right place to kind of deal with how sometimes some of our biases or attitudes may impact police action. I know we've talked a little bit about how we can shape some policy around implicit biases or attitudes or different things like that. So I do still support the idea of kind of segueing that out. But to the extent that that's not the case right now, I do think there's some questions here about whether the discretion that was exercised on behalf of Officer 1 were influenced, or whether were not influenced by personal biases or attitudes, but because there is a question of that, and I don't have access to body-worn camera footage that can completely dispel me of that question, nor were these questions explored during the administrative investigation. I could not sustain, but I chose to not sustain as opposed to exonerate. As far as Officer 2 and 3, you all mentioned all of the comments that they made. The comment that was made about the complainant being an effing B, although it was made out of earshot, I do still sustain on that because I support the idea that Selena mentioned, in that when officers are on duty, they are on a public call, they're on publicly paid for recorded devices. And obviously now, this was not necessarily the case before, but and body-worn cameras are relatively new too, right? So I think there's some grace to be exercised there in that these are new things that we're having to kind of parse out. The policy does say that this professionalism is expected at all times. I do think, as one of my policy recommendations, that the policy could use a little bit of clarification about what at all times means. Do you mean just within earshot of the complainant? Because we've also had an incident where a complainant FOIA'd their body-worn camera footage and then heard the officer making profane comments about him, which could happen at any time. And then you also have us, members of the community, reviewing this and then discussing this. So it's going to become, public knowledge in some way, shape, or form. And I think the spirit of the policy is that we want to discourage behavior that is going to paint the officer or the department in an unprofessional way, or a way that doesn't command respect. So I agree with you all in that there's no good reason why that should be done, especially during the call. I also thought that the comments about the sticker, giving the kids a sticker, for being good during the stop. I think it was staying cool. I thought that that was particularly insensitive given the trauma that they had just gone through. I think that, you know, what is part of this discussion is it's not just necessarily a police thing or any specific officer thing, but just as a society, I think that we have become desensitized to the image of Black kids in handcuffs because it happens too much. And I think, you know, to make light of the situation by saying, you know, you did good, and so here, you know, y'all should get some stickers, that just it just emphasizes the desensitization of it. There were also no apologies issued. Just 1 second, baby. Okay, I'll get it for you. There was no apologies issued, you know, at the conclusion of what happened here, no recognition of how, just 1 second, baby, of how this might have impacted them. And, you know, as we know that they didn't have any sort of culpability in any of this situation. So I think that could have been handled a lot differently. And I was disappointed to see that. As far as duty responsibilities, I sustained the 3 subject officers. However, I'm not sure what the roles were of officers 4, 5, 6, and 7 in and I'm excluding the supervising officer because he came at the conclusion of the call, but I don't know what the roles were of the other officers in terms of the decision making around handcuffing them, or if they physically handcuffed them, because again, we didn't have access to the footage, but the report did not say specifically who did what. So just as an aside, I would say if there may be issues, which, you know, we're just learning about these issues as they come up. So this is not something that I think was written with the idea in mind that we may not get access to the report later. Sorry, just 1 second, y'all.
That's okay.
Solo parenting. 1 second.
She's our
So yeah,
junior member.
I don't think the report was written with the you know, with the pre-knowledge that we were not going to have access to the footage. And so I think if that were the case, there probably would have been a little bit more detail given about what officer did what. So just as an aside, when we, you know, have this issue come up again, it would be helpful to have a little bit more information there so we can kind of make an assessment on conduct, even if we don't have access to the footage. So as it pertains to duty responsibilities, I separated my analysis for the complainant, as you mentioned earlier, Julie, versus the juveniles. I think, you know, there's definitely room for us to have discussion about how the complainant could have possibly been investigated without being handcuffed, maybe being taken out of the vehicle, put on the side of the road. I've seen that in various other calls before where someone is pulled out of the vehicle for a DUI or different things like that, and maybe not immediately arrested until they figure out what's going on. And, you know, being that it was broad daylight and she's in a, you know, minivan full of kids, that she's not very likely to run off and leave in the van. I think just circumstantially, there could have been a slightly different approach. But again, this is discretion. I think that there is articulable discretion if they did think that this was, you know, some type of stolen vehicle, that, you know, potentially they could have justified that. I probably would have still not sustained that, but I think I still reach a sustained finding in this because of the kids that were handcuffed, which I think, you know, warrant a completely different analysis. So for any of the officers on the call that were involved, I would sustain involved in handcuffing the juveniles. I will also say that I think all of the officers should have been interviewed. All of the officers on the call should have been interviewed for purposes of thoroughness, and that did not take place. So that's another reason why we're not able to really fully ascertain who did what, but just kind of piece together what we think happened. Additional allegations. I think that the complainant also alleged that the officer was particularly aggressive when handcuffing her and also aggressive with her children. I don't have any indication that that was actually the case. You know, physically, I didn't necessarily think that there was a a particularly aggressive nature of handcuffing, but I do think that that should have been addressed just for purposes of being thorough. And I also think that it's good practice to assess any incident where handcuffs or an arrest are used as a way to avert de-escalation, because the use of force policy does specifically require officers to use de-escalation tactics. And I think that's one of the main things that was missing from this call was the use of de-escalation tactics. So I think that should have been, potentially looked at under a use of force analysis. But just because this complainant specifically alleged that they were physically aggressive, some of the officers, we should have looked at that. And then, as you all have stated, bias-free policing certainly should have been a part of this. One of the officers during their interview mentioned that that the complainant may have called them racist during the stop, and that word alone should have triggered some additional questions, but it did not. The complainant didn't specifically say that in her written complaint or in her administrative interview, but she does say many times, "I didn't feel safe. I felt like I was, physically being threatened." She mentioned, feeling similar to the Breonna Taylor situation, all of which, have a lot of undertones to me of, wanting to explore why she felt unsafe, particularly because, to my knowledge, no officers made, any overt verbal threats to her. But so it's more so like their presence or their actions or what have you, that may have impacted how she felt. And I think that's something that we should look at. The other things that I wanted to touch on, quality of the investigation. I talked about the officers, not all the officers being interviewed. I agree that a lot of the questions were extremely leading. I think that, and I also mentioned that there was no reference to some of the other officers' roles. And I also want to emphasize what you all talked about earlier, which was that there was no analysis on the impact of the stop on Miss Thomas and her children. And I think I would go so far as to say in some instances it was kind of made light of. And I think that's particularly concerning because I think, what you were talking about, Charles, in terms of dehumanization, I mean, it's not hard for me as an oversight practitioner, but especially as a mother and especially as a Black mother to understand why she was upset with that happening and her not even knowing why she had been stopped, why she had been handcuffed, why her kids were being handcuffed until well into the stop. For me, I think it was around like 26-minute mark or so when they were finally able to effectively communicate to her. I understand that she was, upset and maybe more difficult to speak to than someone that was calm, but I do have an issue with characterizing someone that way without fully painting the picture about what missteps might have happened that led to that anger. If she, even as being taken out of the vehicle, had been, and prior to being handcuffed, was given some sort of explanation as to what was going on, and then told, okay, we pulled you out of the vehicle, now we need to get your kids out of the vehicle, and then taking the step to handcuff them, that escalates the situation even more. So you're not addressing all of the actions or inactions or just the lack of like interpersonal communication that would have, I think, landed a lot differently and possibly just changed the outcome of all of this in some ways. And we don't know for sure because it's not what happened, but I do think that could have de-escalated the matter quite significantly. And so I think to focus on her conduct and not what led to it is not a fair analysis. And it definitely dehumanizes, the experience that she had. Recommendation-wise, I mentioned the policy earlier about handling juveniles and clarifying the personal context policy. I also would recommend that the involved officers undergo de-escalation training and interpersonal communication training. And then you mentioned this issue earlier, Selena, the mental issues. I think that's a tricky one. I think if there is some serious concerns about mental health, we now have a co-responder model where we can call licensed professionals to come and advise on how to handle those types of situations. But I do think that just labeling someone as having mental issues without understanding the trauma that they had just gone through, which, I mean, a perfectly normal person without mental health issues could have been significantly traumatized and triggered by that situation and had a reaction. So I think without understanding the context or being a licensed professional to be able to make that call, I have some concerns about labeling someone as having mental health issues, because we certainly don't want that to impact the way that the officers are handling the call without the appropriate information or analysis. I'm so sorry again about my toddler who takes the opportunity to turn up anytime she sees me speaking. But those are the end of my comments. I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone may have.
Thank you, Mummy, and we're happy to have you join us.
Now, get in the house.
And not worried about your needing to be on video the whole time. Any questions for Mummy? Wonderful. Captain Kim, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I just want to say good evening. And I was just sitting back listening to all the comments and just had a couple of points that I wanted to bring out. But I'll start with this. And I think this was brought up a couple of times because this is really important, is that this investigation was conducted almost 14 months ago. So within that 14 months, OPR has made adjustments. We've made adjustments based on the feedback that we've gotten from you, and then sort of learning from these meetings and interactions that I have with you all on a sort of repeating basis. And so what you see here is an investigation that occurred in its infancy stage when we were just starting the community oversight board thing, and to be quite honest, did not involve the IPA or you all or anything like that. And now we're 14 months later. I think we've evolved and improved since then. And so a lot of the things that you all are discussing, I would say, yes, I agree with you. That could have been done better on our part, OPR's part, because ultimately everything that happens in this office lands with me, and sort of the buck stops with me. So, but let me just go over a couple of things that I just wanted to highlight with you all, which is, I think there were some questions about this sort of high risk vehicle stop that was not going to take place, that was going to take place. The officers had a discussion about how to handle this traffic stop prior to making their approach. The officer one, gathers the appropriate number of resources because I believe he thinks that there is a possibility that this is a stolen car, has other officers come with him, and then they make a decision to say, hey, let's modify a traditional high-risk vehicle stop as we would normally do and do a softer approach. So let's de-escalate the situation. Let's modify our approach. Ultimately, everyone needs to be detained. And that's what takes place. And that's why you kind of see this very modified high-risk vehicle stop. There was a discussion point that someone brought up that said, hey, why not just leave the children inside the car instead of bringing them out? At the end of the day, there is a belief that the vehicle has to be towed. So based on just the sheer nature of what you're dealing with, either stolen tags, stolen cars, improperly registered, fraudulent tags, that vehicle has to be towed, meaning it needs to be searched, and there can't be any occupants in that vehicle when it needs to be towed. So putting people back inside that car is not what's done. Once you remove someone from the vehicle and you believe that it's going to be towed, those individuals and those occupants will remain outside of that vehicle for the duration of the traffic stop. Handcuffing the complainant and sort of the length of the investigation. There's a couple of points that, just some minor points. The investigation was long. And this was an officer one's attempt to sort of determine, sort of if there was anything else going on with this investigation. Was this a stolen car? Was this a vehicle tag, a stolen tag that was photocopied and then placed on the car? So officer one Mirandizes the complainant, not once, but twice. Two times, because the complainant doesn't acknowledge their Miranda warning. So he wants to be doubly sure and Mirandizes the complainant a second time. The complainant does not have a driver's license on their person. And so the officer one has to gather the information, confirm the identity of that individual, and then sort of deconflict that. Officer one then sort of has to examine these tags to determine, hey, is this a real tag? Is this a real stolen tag? Is this a photocopy of a stolen tag? And clearly, from Officer one's vantage point, they are unsure. They are unsure what this tag is. Is it fraudulent? Is it stolen? Does it belong on the car? What about the vehicle? Let me make contact. This is Officer one. Let me make contact, or have someone make contact with the originating jurisdiction, Virginia Beach. That takes time. That information needs to come back to that individual to say, hey, let me start this confirmation process. And if it's not a stolen tag, I need to also reach back out to Virginia Beach and say, hey, this is not the tag that was stolen from your jurisdiction. This is actually a photocopy of that tag. Don't take it out of your system. You need to keep that tag in your system because it's floating out there somewhere. And so all these things this Officer one is attempting to do during his investigation. Personal contacts. It's been discussed ad nauseum. I hear what you say. This should have been sustained. There's no other, I'm not going to sit there and say, oh, well, blah, blah. It should have been sustained. The comments that were made should have been sustained. And I will say this, there's an investigation that takes place that you all were involved with, that it takes place much later on, that someone already alluded to, that involved a comment that was made outside the presence of an individual, and we sustain that. This is the evolution of OPR and how we are going to address these things as we move forward. And the last piece that I want to talk about is ACPD does have a juvenile offender policy. We have a policy, just want to throw that out there, unrelated to this case. We do have a juvenile offender policy, 52205. It's on the public website. It talks about how to deal with juvenile offenders. And with that, I'll open it up to Deputy Chief Chamberlain if she has anything to add.
I think that's it. I think that's the big thing. And not only, I think, for the juvenile offenders, it's not something new. It's an evolving policy that we've had. Our policy notes in terms of this go back to 2005. Since 2005, it's been amended 7 different times, depending on how Virginia legislation has changed as well. So the policy exists. The last time was 2020 when there was amendments done, and that is because there was some significant changes on juvenile interviews. And so the policy is there and how we handle juveniles specifically. I just want to make sure that is clear.
That's helpful. I mean, I think part of our challenge was that Officer one said that he never believed that the children were involved with the investigation. So does the policy pertain to juvenile offenders or just juveniles?
It's titled juvenile offenders, and that policy is entitled juvenile offenders.
However, there are indications of when there's an investigation, because at that time you're talking just an investigation on how juvenile offenders are dealt with then.
That's it. That's all we have. And with that, I'll give it back to you.
Thank you. Okay, do members of the COB have any question? Oh, Mummy.
Yeah, sorry, just as a point of clarification, and I put that directive manual 522.05 in the chat. It is not my understanding that it has like specific de-escalation tactics or, you know, things that are specific to kids in there. And that's what I was referring to, like some guidelines around how to handle them in these type of specific circumstances. And to my knowledge, when I discussed it with you, Captain Kim, during our kind of review of the investigation, and I asked, like, are there some guidelines around that? I believe you said no, so it's my understanding that it's not covered here, but I'm not sure if it's covered in any additional training materials.
So if you're talking about policy discussion, then what you're referring to about de-escalation of when dealing with juveniles, I would say this as a broad general statement. ACPD expects its officers to de-escalate the situation regardless of your age, based on what you are dealing with, the behavior of the individual, the situation that you're dealing with, the seriousness of the crime. There's an expectation that if de-escalation is appropriate, then the officer will employ de-escalation tactics. And that is universal across all ages, genders, races, etc. So I think that's a way of me answering your question.
I'll have to look at this more, but I don't see anything in the policy about I mean, there's a warning policy about advising, juveniles to refrain from an offending activity. But yeah, I mean, I think my issue with regard to the handcuffs, although it's different for the children who weren't believed to be part of the investigation, is that the officers did not give any opportunity for them to comply. So the notion that they were being, I forget what the word was, uncooperative, is just difficult to follow, because it does not seem like they were given an opportunity to cooperate. So for the COB, before Charles and I give recommendations or after we give our recommendations, do y'all have any questions? Okay. For preliminary and follow-up, we recommended exonerated, recognizing Mummy's concern about not sustained because Officer 1 could have asked more questions at the beginning of the interview, that's a discretion, not really a violation of the policy. So while I do think that it would have been helpful to ask more questions, he didn't technically violate, there is not evidence that he violated the policy. Sorry, I'm keeping my order straight. For personal contacts, I'm going to go through them all together and then we'll vote on them individually. But for Officer 1, this was exonerated. Officer 2, sustained for the comments, the profanity, the shut up comment, that these were the reference language being professional manner at all times, will not use degrading, profane, abusive, or defamatory language. Employees are expected to be courteous and dignified at all times. So sustained there. And Officer 3 for the profane comments and the kind of mocking comment about the children with stickers, not finding either of those to be courteous and dignified or professional. For duty responsibilities, reiterating what Mummy said, 4 of the officers were not interviewed and were not subject officers. So our recommendation was to sustain a duty violation against all 3 subject officers for the fair and professional manner in which this family was treated, the kind of immediate use of force and not providing an opportunity to cooperate, and that in the officer interviews, their answers did not point to a justification for those actions, that even when it was suggested by the interviewer, they didn't really come to those same conclusions until later. So having those recommendations in mind, do I need to repeat anything, or do you guys have any questions? Or Charles, was there anything you'd like to add? Okay. Then I think we're ready to vote. We'll vote first on Officer 1, preliminary and follow-up investigation, the recommendation being to exonerate. All in favor? Oh, would somebody like to call for a vote? Does anyone interested in voting tonight? Dave's time for me.
I'll move that we vote on recommendations as outlined.
Do I have a second?
I second.
Okay. For the first recommendation that Officer 1 be exonerated for preliminary and follow-up investigations, all in favor, aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay. Dave, sorry, can you clarify?
Yeah, I voted aye.
Oh, okay. Any abstentions? No. Okay.
Sorry, just my
for
clarification. Dave, did you vote A or yay or nay?
I voted in favor of the recommendation, which was
Okay.
aye.
aye.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, procedure. Okay, personal contacts officer 1, the recommendation to be exonerated. All in favor, aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. Any abstentions? Okay. Officer 2, sustain a violation of personal contacts policy. All in favor, aye. Aye. Nay. Any abstentions? Okay. Officer 3, a sustained violation of personal contacts policy. All in favor, aye.
Aye.
Aye. Nay. Any abstentions? Okay.
Sorry, are you recording any votes for Anika? Is she still on the line?
No, she had to drop.
Yeah,
Okay.
Nika's not longer on the line.
Okay, got it. Just making sure. Sorry.
Thank you. No, I was paying attention to that too, but I was like, tab, second look. Okay, so for duty responsibilities for officers 1, 2, and 3, does anyone want to vote on them separately? Does anyone feel the need to vote on them separately? Okay. So a recommendation that all 3 subject officers be sustained violation of duty responsibilities. All in favor, aye. Aye. Any abstentions? Nay. Any abstentions? Okay. So I think we have a unanimous vote for adopting all of the investigation leads recommendations. Captain Kim, recognizing that ACBD had some constraints discussing the juvenile involvement in this case, I would like to go over that policy. Obviously, I just scanned it, so that's not as thorough, but I would like to understand kind of how that's in practice and how the training goes. As I said, we recognize that there are some kind of national best practices and also some recognized limitations of applying, age-based policies. So I think it would be helpful to kind of get some clarity around what the current policy covers, how it's administered, and whether, Deputy Chief Chamberlain mentioned that there have been updates. So, kind of following that history would be helpful to us, and kind of understanding that, recognizing that you guys do update your policies, based on different situations, just kind of talk about what we saw in this case and how we can incorporate best practice in the future. So that would be very helpful to me, and I'll reach out to schedule time. I think for our recommendation, especially pertaining to the CIT training comment, it did seem like, as Mummy recommended, that, interpersonal skills and de-escalation training seemed appropriate. That, the ability to empathize with somebody who's confused and with their family and agitated does seem like it could have gone a long way. I wasn't as concerned with the length of the investigation required. I recognize some of those points. So anyways, okay, we are a little early for a short break. Do we want to take a 5-minute break to keep it moving since we're virtual? Is everyone cool with that? Okay. We will come back at 8:24. Thanks, everyone. The rest of the agenda is public comment, IPA report out, and then previous meeting minutes before open discussion. Thanks, everyone. Finally, it's getting dark. Okay. Let's see. Just waiting on Charles and then we'll resume. Thank you to members of the public for joining us and sticking with us. I know these are long discussions, but we really value your engagement in our meetings. We'll give Charles one more minute. If you're back, but just off camera, let us know. Off mute, please. Wonderful. Okay. So we have 10 minutes carved out for public comment. We will reiterate what Ian said. The comments in this portion of the meeting can be recorded in the video. And since we're a little bit early, we'll record comments until 8:50, which was our scheduled transition time, just for folks who are participating virtually. But if anyone has comments that they want to weigh in, I don't think we received any submitted comments, but feel free to raise your hand or come off camera to participate. Thank you, Ian. Mind reader. Okay. Why don't we leave this up, Ian, and then Mummy, if you're back and want to give your IPA updates, we can hear from you. And Ian, maybe I can get you to queue up the meeting minutes for next screen share, but we'll leave this up for now. Thank you.
I am back. Appreciate y'all's grace in allowing me to continue my comments off camera. My daughter ran out into the street at the end of the call there, so I had to move very quickly and forcefully to get her back inside. She just
Safety
turned
first,
3,
Mummy.
and she has developed a new sense of independence that I am not quite the biggest fan of. So I might need to upgrade my child proofing around here, but I appreciate y'all's grace and apologize for all of the background noise, but she seems to be occupied now. So I will go ahead and jump into my comments. I mainly wanted to just give a kind of, I guess, if you would say mid-year, yeah, we're about mid-year now report. We're about 2 months after the 1-year anniversary of having done our MOU, and let's see, it's November, December, so about 8 months into completing investigations. In that time frame, or since the COB's inception, the COB has done 37 meetings, which I think is really commendable and amazing. We know a majority of those was completing training, and kind of getting acclimated and learning the ropes of what needs to be done, and operationalizing our investigation protocol. And since we have started in November, doing including the COB in the investigative part of the review, the COB has now completed 12 investigations. As Julie alluded to earlier, the COB has now completed all of the cases that are quote unquote backlogged from 2023 that are ready for their review. There are, I believe, 3 more cases that will be reviewed by the COB for 2023, but none of them are ready for the COB to review yet because of, one, the legal issue that Julie alluded to earlier, and the other 2, the investigations are not complete yet. So once those are completed, then we'll plan to address those in the upcoming meetings, hopefully in July or August. But in the meantime, the COB now will just complete the final step of doing the reports, which are done post-meeting, obviously, to capture all of the votes and feedback, recommendations, and findings of the COB members. So we're hopeful that those will get published in the near future. And they'll be available on the IPA COB website for members of the public to look at, as well as all of our meetings that we've had in the past recorded and available online. I say that just from a numbers perspective, but I just want to emphasize like how much of a huge undertaking that is for all of these investigations. COB members spend hours watching body-worn camera footage, having debriefs and meetings and discussing, their analysis on the cases, conferring with one another, looking at policy, doing their own research, and it takes a lot of time. So to have completed this many investigations thus far, especially for a brand new oversight agency, is a huge endeavor, and you all should be very proud of yourselves. And I'm also especially proud of you, Selena, as a brand new member who hit the ground running, completed your training in record timing, and was able to actively participate in tonight's meeting. We're really grateful for you joining us. I'm grateful for all of your service, and I just wanted to highlight that and just kind of forecast where we're at in the kind of investigation timeline, and see if there were kind of any additional questions around that. That's, I think, it for IPA updates. I think we also mentioned a few months back that at the 1 year mark, we are, per the MOU, supposed to do kind of an annual review of the MOU. So that's something that we'll need to circle around to in the very near future. And with that, I will turn it back over to you, Julie.
Thank you. Yes, we, having prioritized the backlog of cases, we have a backlog of administrative issues that we are getting to. And again, very grateful to have Selena on board. We've given her kind of an update and overview on how this works, but living it is different than the training. So I'm really grateful for your active involvement tonight, and we'll be excited to keep working. So our next agenda item is open discussion, and my kind of first question was just, Selena, if there's anything you have from your training or questions kind of coming on board, or tonight's meeting. I'm happy to make time one-on-one. Unfortunately, we can't meet in groups of 3, but we are always kind of trying to figure out when we have enough of a breathing room to get together and socialize. So we'll try to prioritize that, as you've prompted us for a good excuse to revisit our need to socialize a little bit publicly, where members of the public can also join us. So I don't really have other updates for the open discussion. I know we're waiting. Lisa has been very engaged with ACPD and Chief Penn in anticipating a data dashboard that they're going to release. So we'll get a preview of that in one of our next meetings, which we're excited about because, as Charles emphasized, in the emphasis on wanting to co-create, we are really grateful to ACPD for being proactive in adopting some of our recommendations, even before they're published in a report. So things like creating a new process, which we have to applaud Captain Kim for, doing the work to create an informal process while we create a formal process of keeping track of the number of times that a gun is pointed at a member of the public. So I think, a year into the MOU, and I don't know, we're probably 8 to 10 months into reviewing cases, 12 cases, has been a lot of work. And we're kind of continuously refining that process and trying to tighten it up. But I do think that the conversations we've had are valuable in creating conversational space to think about how do we marry the needs and the perspectives of, the officers and their need for, safety, security, and protocol, and members of the public who also have a very strong expectation of, safety, security, and of liberty. So I think we're on a good track. I know that some of these cases are more sensitive than others, but we all appreciate the dialogue and the opportunity to kind of have these insights. So if any of the COB members have comments or items for discussion, I'm a little brain fried, so if there's something I'm forgetting, please let me know. Oh, maybe I did this out of order. Ian, can we switch to the previous meeting minutes? Oh, Selena. while Ian queues up our meeting.
Sure.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you very much to everybody for welcoming me and answering all of my questions. I think in particular, Ian and Mummy and Captain Kim and Deputy Chief Chamberlain. I really appreciate everyone's help because I know it's been quite a lot of effort on your part to get me up to speed. And also, the ride along was extremely helpful and really gave me respect for what the officers are doing and what they're going through every day. And I think that I look forward to the additional ride-alongs and getting additional education on that. But that really, really helped. One question that I did want to just raise, Julie, is the one about community engagement, which you mentioned earlier in the call. And I was wondering if we could perhaps have a discussion about that and what the sort of concerns are in the timeline and stuff. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the initial concern raised by the county board was that, there was a large backlog of cases that we needed to get through. We are having kind of ongoing conversations because there are different portions of that backlog, ACPD's constraints on how quickly they can get through cases until we can set up a protocol to possibly triage some of what they have to fully investigate. So that was kind of put on the back burner until we could get through our burden backlog. The initial conversations we had around community engagement stemmed from members of the public prompting us at our first annual reception, which was, I'm not going to say 100 years ago because that's hyperbolic, but it was a while ago. And we have had repeated calls in the comments of our public meetings for community engagement. We've also had specific members of the public come to us with specific concerns about different communities that have different perspectives on how safe they feel with ACPD, how they feel about ACPD's, protocols and conduct. And we can't make judgments about that until we can engage with them and really understand where they're coming from. So, we had kind of talked about a couple of different opportunities. I think it was you who raised the notion of, the schools being a good venue to kind of get a cross section of, different county, geographical communities and, different groups and folks that can be particularly effective. But we also, have to get creative about how we can access the people who who have an active mistrust and who, may need more support, being able to bring forth their concerns, because we do have, complaints that we review where there are sensitive issues, whether it's pertaining to mental health or, kind of other case specific dynamics. And so wanting to make sure that our perspective, right, we were selected to be a representative cross section, but there are a lot of different types of people in Arlington and we can't represent all of them. So we'll look forward to kind of making a plan. I think we'll probably carve out time in a future meeting to discuss that a little bit, and we'll put together something preliminarily beforehand. Charles, I'm going to let Libby chime in, and then I'll get to you. Libby?
Yeah, sure. Hi, thank you. I'm not sure we said don't engage. I mean, I think it really is more make sure that we're trying to prioritize and get the backlog cleared, which it sounds like you're getting to, which is really good. Happy to hear, sort of thoughts about what you want to do. Really just we're just trying to prioritize and make sure, it feels like with everything getting started, you can't do it all at once and don't expect you to. And so just prioritizing getting some of these cases cleared first, because that seemed like absolutely the most important. And certainly happy to talk about engagement. I'm not saying don't go out. I mean, I assume all of you are out in the community all the time, just anyway, because you live here, right? That's part of the idea. So happy to discuss that more. It's not like don't do this. It's like, let's prioritize and make sure you get this done. Just some worry that a lot of time and effort was spent on being out in the community before you gotten the cases kind of going. That's all, just prioritizing. Hope that helps a little bit.
Thanks, Libby. Charles?
Yes, on the same end of engagement, I'm hopeful that we'll soon be able to hear back from Mummy about the offer that Chief Penn took us up on, as far as Mummy being able to perhaps go to the morning briefings and talk to the officers about the role of the COB and the auditor's office. I was very happy that when that idea popped in my head, Chief Penn seemed to agree with it. In fact, did. So I look forward to hearing back about that. So that's good. With regard on that kind of same tangent, about training, again, just kind of emphasizing and making sure it's in the record that, training is a large part of this. It's just stuck in my head, Officer 3 at minute 1950 in his interview when kind of talking about the readiness was like, there's no classes or CIT, that you can really take on this. And, I'm not sure the veracity of that, but even the fact that was even on the tongue means like, let's keep digging for those classes and those sessions, especially in de-escalation. We've heard before that ACPD is doing far more than they've done in the past. And I look forward to them continuing to dig and continuing to find out ways to provide this knowledge beyond, normal sit and get, classes, but in ways that really speak to the newness of many of our officers and the new learning dynamic of many of our officers, given their age, and the new understandings that we have as a community as far as our expectations and understandings about internalized biases and how they are in all of us. They are in all of us, and what can we do to mitigate the effect? And finally, again, it just has to be in the record. That's why I want to take the opportunity to say it during these comments. I just highly encourage the county attorney and the county board to avail themselves of the resources that they have to solve the juvenile records issue. It's right there. An attorney general opinion, a court order, which is a process and statute, or the declaratory judgment. Those are all avenues that can provide clarity to the most key element of this, which is what's the nature of a juvenile record. As we've seen tonight, though we were able to have such a fruitful conversation, it could have been enhanced so much more if we had that body-worn camera access. So let's hope that we can get that resolved before we have to review matters that really necessitate even more so having that. Those are all the comments that I have, other than saying, Selena, boy, I thought I was quick having to come up to speed. You got me beat. That you came up to speed. You got all those classes. Amazed and welcome.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you.
You reminded me of a couple of things that we have in the queue that I'll just highlight for the community, since we're kind of doing a mid-year update. The budget and authorization for spending, I haven't gotten an update yet, which is probably my lack of follow-up. That it wasn't initially available when we talked about it. So we need to look at that and figure out what our authorization for spending is. We were not able to procure the consultant support that we wanted when we had spoken with ACPD about wanting to get an expert on national best practice in investigating racial bias or bias-free policing generally. So we have an identified expert, and it's within the. My understanding was that the cost was within our budget allocation, but that we were not able to proceed with that at that point. And I think because that's become such a recurring kind of policy issue where, as we've said to ACPD, we can't exonerate officers for bias-free policing if we don't have enough evidence from a proper investigation to be able to do so. And so our kind of status quo right now is to not sustain those allegations because we don't have enough evidence one way or the other in order to do so. So I will make sure that we get at our next meeting an update on our budget and authorization for spending it, so we can think about other priorities. Related to that, ACPD and I had a conversation about training that they offered to let me go and experience. They have some training that is for the officers related to drawing and pointing your weapon and the need to use, the having of a firearm and the need to put it on. And because that issue came up a couple of times and we made the recommendation, it was raised to my awareness that it is difficult to imagine what the officer experience is like And so since they have some resources available for that, I said I would be delighted to do it. And so if others are interested in that, we can explore it as part of our kind of ongoing training update requirements. I think that would be really valuable. Again, kind of maintaining our focus on the officer perspective, the community perspective, and, kind of our more global policy, to inform our more global policy recommendations. And then the third thing is, as Mummy said, we are due to revisit the MOU, and we have identified some elements of the ordinance that create operational challenges that, whether it's updated or not, we need to kind of come up with a more clear protocol that we can apply uniformly and not delay these cases. So we've had, meetings rescheduled and cases moved around, and it is difficult for volunteer members who are juggling all of these things that, we're queued up to review one thing and then it gets moved or changed and the date's moving around. So if members of the public have been confused about that, it's been a little bit frustrating for us too. But I think that we are building a very strong co-creation process with ACPD, and that these conversations fuel that. So Lisa, Dave, any other remarks for open discussion?
Not for me. Looking forward to following up on some of the requests for public engagement, and similarly on the whole notion of co-creation, which is really valuable and important, and just looking forward to following up on that.
Okay, thank you. Our next meeting is currently scheduled for July 10th, I believe. Do we have any issues there?
I can't make that. I have a commitment.
Did we talk about this already? Is it the 17th? This is embarrassing. Sorry, everyone.
I'll double check.
Would the 17th work for folks?
I also, the 10th is I have an issue, a conflict on the 10th as well. And you're saying now the 17th?
Yeah.
If I may, can I just throw out there that we may need to figure this out offline, because the next 3 cases from 2023 that you all would have to review, I'm not sure if they'll be ready or not by the time your next meeting would be scheduled, which is usually the second Wednesday. So we may have to figure out the timeline around those before we can set in stone a meeting date, unless you all just want to have like an administrative meeting. But I think it would be more effective if we can plan them around when the other investigations will be ready to review.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
I hear you. I do think that we might benefit from an administrative meeting, because we do have, a couple of different things but I'll take the conversation offline, get folks conflicts, because we need to know about Anika too. We are tight on a physical quorum. So we can have one member absent or virtual, but we got to make sure that we've got everyone in place. Although I guess for an administrative meeting, we might not need a vote on anything. So we'll talk about that offline. Anything else before we adjourn?
The agenda or the meeting minutes from last meeting.
Oh, Ian, my mind reader, my very, very, very valuable second brain, or probably first brain. Okay. I did review these. I didn't see any issue, but if we want to scroll through just for anyone who's got better eyes or a better memory than me.
Don't worry, Selena, I will go through and correct all the autocorrect spellings here.
Thanks, Ian.
And I'll fix the alignment of this chart.
That's okay. I was going to say, I did review these. I did review the meeting minutes and these to make sure they were correct.
Okay.
So, thank you. Okay. Do I have a motion to approve the previous meeting minutes?
So moved, Charles.
Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Okay. All in favor of approving the previous meeting minutes, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay. Any abstentions? Wonderful. And the meeting is adjourned. Thank you guys so much. Thank you to members of the public and the county board and ACPD for your time tonight, and other Arlington County staff. We appreciate you and we'll see you next time. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
all. Bye.